Hello, I'm Brian, and I'm the Theoretical Gamer. This is a sort of a history of me and gaming. The history of me gaming. Brian's history of gaming. I do not have... I'm not one of those people that has like a clear line of memory starting like from, like on such and such date, this happened. I just have a series of flashes. I don't have a great memory for my own life. It's weird. My sister will tell me things that happened in our childhood. Hey, Brian, do you remember when this and this happened and we did this and me and our friends went out to do this? And I was like, no. So she's the one with the memory. But I do have images and I do have certain memories, as disjointed as they are. Grew up in Dudley, North Carolina, out in the sticks, out in the middle of nowhere. All in all, our lifestyle was fairly normal and fairly, it seemed fairly middle class to me growing up. We didn't seem poor. We didn't really want for anything. But looking back, we had moved down to North Carolina to be close to a sick relative. And I think it was kind of like we took what we could get when it came to where we would live. We lived basically in a mobile home in basically what turned out to be kind of a flood zone. And it was one of those things that as a little kid, you didn't even know about that until, all we knew is that a lot of our neighbors got flooded out a lot. And we were fairly lucky in that regard. We never got it really bad. But, when we first lived there, we basically was in a mobile home and you got in and out of the house via a set of stairs that was made out of cinder blocks, just stacked up. And eventually, after we started and got settled, and my dad got a job, my mom got a job on the local Air Force base as a secretary, and we started to turn this place into a home. We built on a new addition to the house. We built on a new room, which for as long as we were living at the house, we always called it the new room. Like a decade later, it's the new room. We built a huge deck, which you could put lawn chairs on, and that replaced the cinder blocks. But it was out in the middle of nowhere, so, and we had some neighbor kids, but that was really it. And you could tell that we, after we got settled, they were doing okay because Mom and Dad were able to send my sister and I to a private school, St. Mary's Catholic School in Goldsboro, North Carolina. And, we wore uniforms and half our teachers were nuns and all in all, it was just a school. We liked it. We liked our classmates and it was a nice place. So I'm at school one day and I go to the school library and I just want something to read, something to borrow and take home. So I go to the librarian and ask her for a suggestion. And out of nowhere, she just says, The Hobbit. The Hobbit? That was a nonsense word. I had never heard the word Hobbit before. So I said, okay. I took a chance. I trusted her. And I went and I got The Hobbit. Took it home. And even The Hobbit, which was designed as a children's book, Tolkien has a rather dry writing style. And for a little kid with a short attention span, there were parts that just dragged. I tended to have I had a tendency to skim sometimes. And it depends on the book. So if it was a fairly light book, I could blaze right through it. But if it was, fairly heavy, I would skim. And Tolkien is a fairly heavy author. And you know what? It didn't matter because I was still into it. The parts that I got, I loved. First of all, Hobbit, that's cool. I never know what a hobbit was. And of course, in the first couple of pages of the first chapter, he's explaining what a hobbit is. And then all of a sudden, dwarves show up at his house. And the idea of a dwarf being a separate race, of short, beardy guys, was cool. And I think there was even a footnote where Tolkien even mentioned that he had to separate that it was dwarves, not dwarfs, in order to, to correct his proofreader. And I thought that was cool. And I loved the idea that when Bilbo finally got to meet Smaug the dragon, you think of a dragon, you think rah, and that's it. At least I did. And the idea that this dragon was very intelligent and even like urbane and very just devious and powerful in other ways besides being just big and teeth and claws. That was awesome. You gotta realize this. I had no exposure to this sort of thing up to that point, and these were all completely new concepts to me. I was like, fun fact though, Gandalf showed up at the very beginning of the book and starts talking to Bilbo. There was no real mention of Gandalf's height or race. So I made this assumption that Gandalf was like another hobbit, like a wizard hobbit, and was about Bilbo size. And it wasn't until much later that I started to realize that no, he's a tall dude. He's a human, or at least human appearance. But for a while, I pictured him as one of those little guys. So then I got into Lord of the Rings, which was even a bit heavier than that, but I still liked it. I still got into it. It took me a few readings before I finally got the whole story. I loved Gollum. Of course I loved Gollum. I liked the Ents. I liked those guys were cool. I liked Treebeard. So that was pretty much it. And then, next memory I had, I'm at home. I'm a little kid. And I don't really know when this happened. I think it was just a news article on the news, on the 6 o'clock news or something. And it comes on, and it was like one of those slow news day articles where nothing much was happening. So they decided to do an article on this new game that had come out, Dungeons and Dragons. Now this is probably the late 70s or early 80s. Probably, I was a kid, so, and it wasn't it wasn't judgmental. It wasn't, anti-D&D. It was just talking about this unusual game that people were playing. And I remember seeing they had done a little acted out dramatization of people holding swords, wearing capes, walking towards a castle, and then saying, this game is played in your imagination, and giving a basic rundown of what it was, probably very incomplete. And I remember just being a little kid, just going like, just like, that was something that I wanted to play. I wanted it. And I was like, Mom, I want this. I want this game. I want this game. I want this game. Mom had no idea where to get it. She didn't know. So I filed it away in my head. Looking, and asking around and finding. Now, at some point, I met this dude. He was a kid from an older class when I was at St. Mary's. Older kid. More experienced. Had played Dungeons and Dragons. And he had a notebook full of all these things, like this castle that his character had, and these guardians that looked like floating atoms that were these guardians, these special monsters that only he had, and they guarded his castle for him. Now, looking back as an adult with the benefit of hindsight, I'm realizing that this was probably a total Munchkin campaign where the guy was just, he was talking about how his character could become a god or something like that. And I was again, but to little me, it was like, again, I wanted this. I wanted to play this game. So at some point, I got the red box. And I remember looking through it and reading it. It was basically the whole elf as class thing. It was the whole, elf was a class, dwarf was a class, halfling was a class, and then fighter, cleric, thief, and magic user. And it was looking at it and thinking to myself, um, only 3 levels? And that really was it. I said, I have to get another box in order to. Eventually, over time, I managed to get all 5 boxes. And they disappeared on me at some point, some move or another. But it was, and I never really got to play an extended campaign, sadly, though. But I remember playing one game, my first game that I remember playing, was in the library at St. Mary's Catholic School. And like all those stories you hear about, the religious types freaking out over it, that didn't happen there. We were just, playing D&D, and we just sat down and we played. And one of the players that I played with was one of those people that it's the type of person you later learn to avoid because they're just dicks. And so I create my character, and we enter the dungeon, and the first thing that happens is he turns and kills my character. Right? And I'm thinking, wait a minute, does he want to does he want to kill all of us and be left alone in the dungeon to be killed by monsters? And I asked him about this, why'd you do that? And he said, I'm chaotic. And he really was just the kind of guy who the only fun he had was in destroying other people's fun. That was, the idea of a group having fun with each other is something that he didn't get. It was like, some is a zero fun game. If someone else is having fun, it lowers your fun. So you have to take fun away from other people. That's his philosophy. I'm sure you've all met people like that, and you've learned not to game with them. Right? It's, okay, at some point, I left St. Mary's and I went to Southern Wayne Senior High School. Basically, St. Mary's only went up to 9th grade. And at 10th grade, moved over to an actual public school. Which was a little scary, considering I wondered what public school would be like, and it turned out to be not that big a difference. It was school. A lot more people. Didn't have to wear a uniform. It was, but I made some friends there, and we turned out to get into a regular game. I got into a regular gaming group. Some of them were friends. One of them was a kid guy who was a couple of years older than us and lived out of town, but was willing to travel to Dudley or wherever to play with us. I think we met him at a comic book store, and we exchanged numbers, and we called him now and then and said, his name was Randy, and he was kind of like, looking back, kind of the social retard of the group. He was a nice guy, but he was also kind of very shy and very introverted, and he had this really, and his grandparents were super religious and had a big influence on his life. So as a result, but he was a good guy, and he would game master, and he was really good. He was just the weird one of the group. But we liked him, and he was a good player, and he wasn't unpleasant in any way, so we liked him. And then, but most of it was so basically that was it. And we played we got into other games besides D&D. I remember playing, we played a little bit of, I think Ghostbusters, which was out, I think that was out back then. The Ghostbusters role-playing game when it came out. It was the first game that really did genre emulation. It tried to be, Ghostbusters might have come later, but the thing is, we also played Teenager from Outer Space, which was like crazy, wild, over-the-top silliness. And that was by R. Talsorian Games. And we loved that one because it was just us creativity unbound. We could throw anything into the mix, and there wasn't much in the way of challenges but it was just an exercise in just doing whatever the hell we wanted and making each other laugh, which which can be a hell of a lot of fun. Uh, like we would come up with these weird inside jokes, like the ultimate Barcalounger. Like one of the characters was this high-tech wizard who turned a Barcalounger into these like the ultimate weapon. Stupid stuff like that. You know, that we would be laughing about forever. I graduated high school, joined the Navy. On board, basically continued to game off and on ship. There, when I was out at sea, sometimes we would set up on the mess deck after dinner. We would set up a table, and various ones of us would play. And I remember playing GURPS Fantasy. This one guy ran a game of GURPS Fantasy, and looking back, he was one of those game masters that every single NPC in his universe has a grumpy, combative attitude. You know, the standard greeting in his world was, "What do you want?" You know, it felt like that if any of his NPCs were nice to you for any reason, he would lose. He'd lose that conversation, and he didn't like to lose. I don't know his reasoning. I don't know if he just wanted it to seem, you know, hard-edged or something, but that's what it was. I mean, no one was nice to anyone. They were just sort of grunting at each other. That was the whole world. And, but all in all, we had fun, and I made some friends. And, we played a lot of different games. I played, we were out, there was a kind of a nerd store out in town, because the ship was home ported in Charleston, South Carolina, and since it was a supply and repair ship, spent a lot of time in port, and made a lot of friends out in town. Got to play like Rifts. Vampire came out during that time, I think. Then got out, spent a year back home in North Carolina. Moved up to Indiana for a few years. Joined the Evansville Gaming Guild. Played a lot of games during that time. Made a lot of friends. Then I think what ended up happening was a friend of mine moved out to Portland, Oregon. And he convinced me that Portland was paradise on earth and that I should move out there. And he'd give me a place to crash for a while. So that's what happened. I moved out there. And I was there for 9 months. There was nothing really there for me. It rained all the time, which didn't bother me too much. I wouldn't have minded so much if there was a job, a decent job for me to have. So after 9 months, I came back to North Carolina. By this time, I think the internet is what did me in. By this, I got into the habit of go to work, go home, fart around on the internet. And I moved back to North Carolina, and I stayed at my sister's place for a while, and she at the time was staying with her boyfriend. So I pretty much had my own place. And I got a job at a supermarket, and it was go to work, come home, got a part-time job delivering pizza, fart around on the internet. And that's very, very easy to fall into for a long period of time, especially when it's like I'd come back to Raleigh and I didn't know anyone there, and I didn't have the huge group of friends or at least moderate-sized group of friends that I had cultivated in other areas. You know, I didn't have my high school group of friends. I didn't have my Evansville Gaming Guild group of friends that I was with up in Indiana. They were... So it was very, very easy for me to just kind of slip into the daily routine. Now, I did, however, download a program called OpenRPG, which is basically a chat program with dice rollers and map software built in. And so it's like you're playing a game, but you're not talking. You're just typing what you're saying and describing, which I've described as the difference between watching a movie and reading a book. They have different strengths. I can be a lot wittier when I'm thinking and typing out what I plan to say. But the problem is, after several years with that group, it got harder and harder to remember when it was game night. I know that sounds terrible, but it was like I couldn't muster up the enthusiasm much anymore. I popped in again recently, and it was okay, and it was nice to see everyone, but then the next week I forgot about it again. Because it's like, you sit down, you type, and then you wait for someone to respond, and maybe they're away from the keyboard, and maybe... So you get up, you walk off, you come back, have they posted? You start watching videos. It wasn't bad. We had some good games, and we had some good stories. But it was hard to like stay focused. It was hard to stay into it in the same way that you are when you've got faces in front of you and voices that you're hearing. And I guess I started to miss that. Then, very recently, Google Plus happened. And I started to think, hey, maybe... And that's about where I am now. Google Plus is out there. YouTube is out there. I'm starting to make use of those things. I haven't actually gotten into any games. I would like to run one because I just do. I just want to. To me, that would be more satisfying than just sitting and being a player. I like being this. I like telling the story. I like being, the moving engine behind it. Of course, as I've said in other videos, I have problems coming up with stories, which I think there's some reasons behind that, but that's a story for another time. And that's really it. If anyone else has any stories similar to this, let me know, and I will see you later.